He had been walking for 3 hours through the lower forges when Magos Explorator Valonqor first smelled the burning. Not promethium, not the sweet chemical reek of blessed machine oil igniting in prayer. This was meat, human meat, charring in air that had not been filtered through sanctified vents. The smell clung to the back of his throat like a prayer he could not speak, and in that moment, standing in a tunnel that did not exist on any map of Forge World Metallica, Kor understood that he had found what he had been searching for. He also understood that this knowledge would kill him. The tunnel stretched ahead, its walls slick with condensation that should not have existed this deep in the manufactorum levels. His augmetic eyes cycled through spectrums, each filter revealing layers of reality that contradicted the official schematics he had memorized during his 3 centuries of service. Thermal bloom suggested massive energy expenditure. Radiation signatures spoke of processes that had been forbidden since the dark age of technology. And beneath it all, a biological signature that made his organic components recoil with instinctive revulsion. Something was alive down here. Something that breathed and pulsed and grew in chambers that the fabricator general swore did not exist. Kor had begun his investigation 6 standard months ago, after a routine audit of material shipments revealed an anomaly so subtle that 99% of his peers would have dismissed it as clerical error. 3,000 kilograms of gene seed-grade biological compounds had been requisitioned to a facility designation that terminated in a numerical sequence reserved for sectors destroyed during the Horus heresy. When he had brought this to the attention of Magos Logis, Than, his immediate superior, the older priest had looked at him with eyes that held too many centuries of compromise. Some mysteries serve the Omnissiah best when left unexamined, Explorator. Your diligence is noted. Now redirect your attention to the Astropath relay maintenance schedule. The dismissal had been absolute. The fear beneath it had been unmistakable. That fear had been the catalyst. Kor had served the machine god faithfully since the flesh of his childhood had been judged worthy of transcendence. But he had never forgotten the lesson that had been beaten into him during his decade as an apprentice in the deep forges of Mars. Fear meant secrets. Secrets meant power, and power in the Mechanicus flowed not from the Omnissiah's blessing alone, but from the careful hoarding of knowledge that others believed lost or forbidden. The tunnel opened into a chamber that stole the breath from his remaining organic lung. It was vast, easily 500 meters in diameter, its ceiling lost in a gloom that his augmented vision could not penetrate. The walls were lined with machinery that predated the Imperium, great Baroque constructs of brass and steel that pulsed with a rhythm disturbingly similar to a heartbeat. And in the center, suspended in a web of cables thick as a man's torso, hung something that should not have existed. It was partially organic, its surface a nauseating blend of chitin and synthesized flesh that glistened wetly under the dim red light. Veins of circuitry ran beneath translucent skin, carrying data in pulses of bioluminescence. As Kor watched, frozen by a horror that overrode his augmented combat reflexes, the thing twitched. A limb, if it could be called such, extended from its mass. At its tip, a cluster of eyes opened. They were human eyes, green and hazel and brown, blinking in independent rhythms as they focused on him. Explorator Kor. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that bypassed his audio receptors and resonated directly in the organic portions of his brain. Your curiosity is noted. Your dedication to the quest for knowledge is admirable. But you have made a critical error in judgment. From the shadows at the chamber's edge, figures emerged. They wore the red robes of the Mechanicus, but the symbols embroidered on their vestments were wrong. Corrupted. The gear and cog of the machine god had been subtly altered, sprouting additional teeth that formed patterns Kor recognized from forbidden texts he had glimpsed during his training. Xenos glyphs, elder perhaps, or worse, the writhing characters of the Rangdan that had nearly destroyed humanity during Old Night. The lead figure pushed back its hood, revealing a face that had been extensively modified. Where a human mouth should have been, a complex array of manipulator tendrils wreathed, each tipped with what appeared to be a sampling needle. The voice that emerged from this nightmare of augmentation was calm, almost gentle. "I am Genitor Prime Xanatov. Welcome to the Crimson Covenant, Magos Corps. You have discovered the future of the Mechanicus, and now you must choose whether you will be part of that future or fuel for its realization." The choice, Kor understood with sudden terrible clarity, was no choice at all. To understand how the Mechanicus could harbor such abominations within its sacred ranks, one must first comprehend the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the cult Mechanicus itself. The priesthood of Mars preaches absolute adherence to the quest for knowledge, the sacred duty to recover and preserve the technology of humanity's lost golden age. Yet simultaneously, they forbid innovation, declaring that all true knowledge has already been discovered, and that the role of the faithful is merely to rediscover what was lost. This paradox creates a tension that has defined the Mechanicus since its founding, and within that tension, cults of forbidden learning have festered like tumors in organic flesh. The Genitor sect represents perhaps the most insidious of these divergences. Officially, Genitors are the biological specialists of the Mechanicus, charged with maintaining the organic components required for servitor creation and the management of Forge World populations. Their work is sanctioned, their methods approved through millennia of theological precedent. But beneath this legitimate facade, there exist factions within the Genitors who pursue a darker vision. They see the human form not as a sacred template to be preserved, but as raw material to be improved, refined, and ultimately transcended. Their workshops, hidden in the deepest reaches of Forge worlds throughout the galaxy, have produced horrors that would make even the most jaded Inquisitor pray for the Emperor's mercy. Kor had learned this truth over the days that followed his capture. They had not killed him. Instead, Genitor Prime Xanatov had done something far worse. He had educated him. The Crimson Covenant. Xanatov explained, as they walked through chambers filled with impossible things, had its roots in the earliest days of the Imperium. When the Emperor had first come to Mars and forged his alliance with the Mechanicum, there had been factions among the tech priests who viewed the bargain with suspicion. They had spent centuries pursuing their own vision of human transcendence, free from the constraints of old Earth superstitions. The Emperor's arrival, with his demands for standardization and his insistence on certain ethical boundaries, had threatened to end their most promising research. But we adapted, Xanatov said, his tendril mouth writhing in what might have been a smile. We learned to hide our work within the vast bureaucracy of the Mechanicus. We embedded our people in positions of authority throughout the Imperium. We became patient. And over 10,000 years, we have built something magnificent. He led Kor to a viewing gallery overlooking a vast laboratory space. Below, dozens of tech priests worked at stations that blended surgery, genetic manipulation, and something that looked disturbingly like sorcery. On examination tables, subjects writhed in various stages of transformation. Some were clearly human, their flesh being systematically replaced with organic augmentations that bore no resemblance to approved Mechanicus implants. Others had progressed beyond any definition of human, their forms twisted into new configurations that seemed to serve no purpose Kor could identify. And at the far end of the chamber, in a massive vat of amniotic fluid, something floated that made Kor's remaining organic components flood with instinctive terror. It was perhaps 3 meters tall, vaguely humanoid, but possessed of too many limbs, each terminating in a different specialized appendage. Its head, if that term could be applied, was a mass of sensory organs and data ports. As Kor watched, one of the janitors approached the vat and interfaced directly with the creature through a cable that emerged from his own skull. The thing's eyes opened, all 17 of them. "We call them evolved," Xanatov said with evident pride. "The next stage of human development. Stronger, more intelligent, infinitely adaptable. Each one is custom designed for its role, whether that be combat, research, or administration. They retain human consciousness, human ambition, but freed from the limitations of the baseline form. Within 3 generations, we estimate they will be capable of breeding true. At that point, the question of what defines humanity will become rather academic." Kor found his voice, though it emerged as a distorted rasp through his voxcaster. "This is heresy of the highest order. The Fabricator General would see you all executed. The Inquisition would burn this entire Forge world to bedrock." Xanatov's tendril mouth performed that unsettling smile again. "The Fabricator General of Metallica is one of us, Kor. Has been for 70 years, since we cured his degenerative neural condition with techniques derived from elder genetic mapping. As for the Inquisition, they have their own secrets to protect. We have provided them with servitors and biological weapons for their crusades. They ask few questions about our methods. The Imperium runs on moral compromise, Explorator. We are simply more honest about it than most." The scope of the conspiracy became clearer as Kor was given access to the Crimson Covenant's archives. They were not a small cell of rogue janitors operating in isolation. They were a network that spanned dozens of Forge worlds, with sympathizers and full members embedded at every level of the Mechanicus hierarchy. Their funding came from legitimate budgets, their materials requisitioned through official channels, their research protected by layers of misdirection and bureaucratic obfuscation that had been refined over millennia. They had learned to hide their work not through secrecy alone, but through the simple expedient of making it appear mundane. A request for biological compounds became lost among 10,000 identical requests. An unauthorized power draw was attributed to calibration errors. Test subjects disappeared into the vast population of servitors and thralls and kept the Forge worlds functioning, their absence noted by no one, and their ambitions extended far beyond simple genetic manipulation. In another chamber, Kor was shown xenos artifacts that had been carefully disassembled and studied. Elder psychic amplifiers, orc spores that had been genetically modified to produce useful compounds. Fragments of Necron technology that should have been destroyed on sight, but had instead been painstakingly reverse-engineered. The Covenant viewed the Mechanicus prohibition against xenos technology not as sacred law, but as an obstacle to be circumvented. If alien races had developed useful capabilities, then those capabilities were simply data to be extracted and integrated. The source was irrelevant. Only the knowledge mattered. "We are not heretics," Xanatov insisted during one of their daily conversations. "We are the truest servants of the Omnissiah. The machine god gave us intellect for a reason, Explorator. To stagnate is to die. To refuse innovation is to betray the very essence of what it means to seek knowledge. The official Mechanicus has become a death cult, endlessly recycling ancient designs while humanity slowly loses ground to every threat in the galaxy. We seek to reverse that decline, to make humanity stronger. Is that not a holy endeavor?" Kor had no answer. The logic was seductive, particularly to one who had spent centuries watching the Imperium's slow rot. How many expeditions had he led into the darkness, searching for STC fragments that might contain some miraculous technology, only to return with corrupted data or devices whose function remained forever mysterious? How many times had he seen brilliant minds crushed beneath the weight of dogma, their innovations condemned as tech heresy simply because they dared to think beyond approved parameters? The Mechanicus preached the quest for knowledge while simultaneously forbidding the very innovation that had created the wonders they sought to rediscover. The contradiction was maddening, but the cost was written in the twisted flesh of the subjects screaming in the laboratories below. The cost was measured in the souls of those who had volunteered for transformation and emerged as something that might no longer qualify as human under any reasonable definition. The cost was the steady erosion of the boundaries that separated humanity from the xenos horrors that surrounded it on all sides. You are wondering whether the end justifies the means, Xanatov observed, his many eyes studying Kor with unnerving intensity. It is a question we all ask ourselves. But consider this, Explorator. In the time we have been speaking, approximately 3 million humans have died in service to the Imperium. They have been sacrificed to power the Astronomicon. They have been ground up in wars of conquest and defense. They have been processed into servitors to fill roles that more efficient automation could handle if we were not bound by ancient prohibitions. The Imperium is already a charnel house, Kor. We simply seek to ensure that the sacrifice has meaning, that something better emerges from all that death, days blended into weeks. Kor was given freedom to move through the Covenant's facilities, to observe their work, to speak with their members. He met janitors who wept as they described watching their Forge worlds fall to xenos invasions because approved technology had proven inadequate. He met former loyalists who had embraced the Covenant's methods after seeing their families perish in plagues that could have been cured if biological research had not been so stringently controlled. He met true believers who spoke of human transcendence with the fervor of prophets, their eyes bright with visions of a future where humanity had shed the weaknesses of flesh and dogma alike. And he met those who had undergone the transformation themselves. Magos Genitor. This had been one of the Covenant's earliest success stories, her baseline human form enhanced with genetic modifications derived from a dozen xenos species. She stood 3 meters tall now, her muscles enhanced with orc-myogene sequences, her reflexes boosted with patterns extracted from the nervous systems of Eldar Rangers who had fallen in battle. Her skin had been re-engineered to resist temperature extremes and radiation. Her bones were laced with a calcium composite that made them nearly unbreakable. When she demonstrated her capabilities in the training halls, moving with speed that should have been impossible for something her size, Kor felt a mix of revulsion and envy so intense it threatened to overwhelm his emotional regulators. I can think faster now. This told him after the demonstration, her voice a deep rumble that emerged from a larynx that had been restructured to handle the increased air flow her enhanced body required. Process information at rates that would require a cogitator array for a baseline tech priest. I can interface with machine spirits at a depth that was impossible before. And I am strong enough to tear a space, marine limb from limb, should the need arise. Tell me, Explorator, am I still human? Does it matter? I serve the quest for knowledge more effectively than I ever could have in my original form. Is that not what the Omnissiah demands of us? The question haunted Kor through sleepless cycles spent in the small chamber they had given him. What did it mean to be human in an age where humanity itself was a fluid concept? The Imperium had already accepted massive variations from the baseline form. Space Marines were gene-forged demigods. Navigators had been mutated by their own bloodlines into something barely recognizable as the species that had birthed them. Sanctioned psychers had their souls open to the warp in ways that fundamentally altered their relationship with reality. Where was the line? Who had the authority to draw it? And if that line was arbitrary, based on tradition rather than reason, then was the Covenant not justified in its efforts to push beyond it? But then he would remember the screaming. The laboratories were well insulated, but sound carried through ventilation shafts and along the metal bones of the Forge world. Not all transformations were successful. Not all volunteers survived the process. And those who failed left behind remains that were buried in unmarked chambers. Their fate recorded only in data logs that would be purged once the relevant research had been extracted. The Covenant's pursuit of knowledge was built on a foundation of suffering, and no amount of philosophical justification could wash that blood away. On the 43rd day of his captivity, Xanatov summoned him to a chamber Kor had not seen before. It was smaller than the grand laboratories, more intimate. The walls were lined with data screens, displaying genetic sequences and biological schematics that would take years to fully comprehend. In the center of the room stood a medical throne, its arms equipped with manipulator appendages and injection ports. The message was clear. "You have learned our secrets," Xanatov said. "You understand our mission. Now you must choose Magos Core. Join us fully. Undergo the enhancement procedures that will make you worthy of our trust. Or refuse, and force us to dispose of you in a manner that ensures our security. There is no third option. No return to your previous life." That ended the moment you entered these chambers. Kor looked at the throne, looked at the Genitor Prime's inhuman face, looked at his own hands, still mostly flesh despite decades of augmentation, and tried to imagine them transformed into something else. Something stronger, something better, something that might no longer be him in any meaningful sense. "How many have refused?" he asked. Xanatov was silent for a long moment. "Fewer than you might think. Most of those who come to understand our work eventually embrace it. The logic is compelling. The alternative is to accept stagnation while the galaxy burns. But there have been some who could not make that leap. Their deaths were swift, painless. We are not sadists, Explorator. We are pragmatists." Kor thought of the 3 centuries he had served the machine god, the prayers he had offered in countless shrines throughout the galaxy, the sacred oils he had used to anoint the machine spirits in his care, the absolute faith he had maintained that the path of the Mechanicus, however constrained by dogma, was ultimately righteous. And he thought of the alternative Xanatov offered, a future of enhancement and transcendence, purchased at the cost of everything that defined him as a servant of Mars. "I need time," he said finally. "This is not a choice to be made lightly." "You have 6 hours," Xanatov replied. "Use them wisely." The Genitor Prime left him alone in the chamber, alone with the throne and the screens and the weight of an impossible choice. Kor activated his internal chronometer and began to pray, his voxcaster speaking the litany of the machine in a whisper that would not carry beyond the chamber's walls. But the Crimson Covenant was only one manifestation of the rot within the Mechanicus. As Kor had researched the Genitor sect, during his weeks of investigation, he had uncovered hints of other factions, other groups pursuing their own visions of forbidden knowledge. The Covenant had its own intelligence network, and through access to their archives, Kor learned of conspiracies that made even the Genitors seem cautious by comparison. The explorator fleets of the Mechanicus were officially charged with voyaging beyond imperial space in search of lost technology and new worlds to exploit. These expeditions could last decades, even centuries, as they pushed into the darkness beyond the Astronomican's light. And in that darkness, far from the scrutiny of Mars, some explorators had discovered truths that should have remained buried. They had found worlds where the dark age of technology had not ended in fire and madness, but had instead evolved along different paths. They had recovered technologies that worked through principles the Mechanicus could not explain, devices whose function seemed to blur the line between science and sorcery. And rather than report these findings to the Fabricator General for proper theological review, they had kept them, studied them, begun to use them. The archive spoke of Explorator Fleet Sigma 7, which had vanished into the Goal stars 500 years ago and returned with a ship that moved through the warp without a Geller field. The crew claimed to have discovered a method of navigation that did not rely on the Astronomican, that did not require a navigator, that instead used something they called sympathetic resonance with the underlying structure of reality. They had demonstrated this capability before a panel of archmagi, successfully translating from the warp to real space with precision that should have been impossible. Then they had refused to explain how the technology worked, had insisted that the knowledge was too dangerous to be shared. The Fabricator General had ordered their ships impounded for study. Sigma 7 had fought their way clear of the Martian defense grid and fled back into the darkness. They had not been seen since, though reports filtered back, occasionally of ships bearing their insignia, trading forbidden technology to rogue traders and chaos warbands alike in exchange for resources and information. There were others, Explorator Fleet Epsilon 9, which had returned from the Halo stars with their crews transformed into something that was no longer entirely human, their bodies modified with organs and augmentations whose design seemed to draw on Terranid biological principles. They claimed the modifications were necessary to survive in the zones they had explored, regions of space where radiation and exotic particles would kill baseline humans within hours. The truth was likely darker. The archive contained sealed reports suggesting that Epsilon 9 had made contact with something in the Halo stars, something that had changed them in ways that went beyond mere physical enhancement. Inquisitorial observers who had interviewed the fleet's Magos Explorator reported disturbing behavioral changes, a tendency to speak in unison, a loss of individual identity that suggested some kind of gestalt consciousness was emerging among the crew. The Inquisition had recommended that the fleet be destroyed. The Mechanicus had refused, citing the value of their research. Political compromise had resulted in Epsilon 9 being assigned to deep space exploration duties that would keep them far from Imperial worlds. But they were still out there, still operating under Mechanicus authority, still pursuing whatever dark vision had consumed them in the darkness between the stars. And then there was the Illuminated Synod, a faction so secretive that even the Crimson Covenant's archives contained only fragments of information about them. They were believed to be composed primarily of Logis and Magos tier tech priests, individuals whose computational capabilities had been enhanced to the point where their thoughts operated at speeds approaching those of true artificial intelligence. The Synod's central belief, as far as could be determined, was that the machine god was not some distant spiritual entity, but rather an emergent property of sufficiently complex information networks. They sought to create the Omnissiah through the deliberate construction of a galaxy, spanning intelligence network, one that would encompass all of humanity's machines and eventually the human minds that tended them. Their ultimate goal was nothing less than the technological apotheosis of humanity, the merger of man and machine into a single unified consciousness. that would transcend the material universe itself. The implications were staggering. If the Synod succeeded, if they managed to create their artificial deity, what would happen to individual human consciousness? Would humanity as a concept survive such a merger? Or would billions of minds be subsumed into a vast inhuman intelligence? And what would such an entity think of the material concerns of its components? Would it care if individual humans suffered or died? Would it even perceive them as entities worthy of consideration? The archives suggested that the Synod had been working toward their goal for thousands of years, that they had embedded themselves in the infrastructure of the Mechanicus to such a degree that separating them from the legitimate hierarchy would be impossible without causing catastrophic systemic failure. Every noospheric network, every data conduit, every machine spirit across 1,000 Forge worlds had been subtly modified to serve the Synod's purposes. When tech priests accessed the noosphere to share information, they were unknowingly contributing processing power to the Synod's great work. When servitors performed their mindless tasks, they were acting as neurons in a vast distributed intelligence. The machine god that the Mechanicus worshipped was being built all around them, and most would never know it existed until the moment it achieved true consciousness and swallowed their souls. Kor read these accounts with a growing sense of horror that overwhelmed even his augmented emotional regulation systems. The Mechanicus was not simply corrupt. It had been fundamentally compromised at every level. The factions pursuing forbidden knowledge were not isolated cells, but interconnected networks that spanned the galaxy. And they were all working, in their own ways, toward the same end. The transformation of humanity into something else. Something that might be stronger, more capable, more suited to survival in a hostile universe. But something that would no longer be recognizably human. The 6 hours Xanatov had given him passed in prayer and contemplation. Kor cycled through every theological argument he could construct, every logical framework that might provide guidance. The Omnissiah taught that knowledge was sacred, that the pursuit of understanding was humanity's highest calling. But surely there were limits. Surely there were truths so dangerous that they should not be spoken. Technologies so corrosive that they should remain buried. The problem was that the Mechanicus itself could not agree on where those limits lay. Every prohibition was contested. Every doctrine had its interpreters who could find loopholes and exceptions. In the absence of clear divine guidance, the tech priests had fragmented into 1,000 competing factions, each claiming to serve the machine god while pursuing increasingly divergent visions of what that service meant. When Xanatov returned, Kor had made his decision. It was not the decision the Genitor Prime expected. "I will not join you," Kor said. His voice was steady, purged of the fear that should have accompanied such a declaration. "But nor will I allow you to kill me to protect your secrets. I propose an alternative." Xanatov's tendril mouth writhed in what might have been amusement or annoyance. "You are not in a position to negotiate, Explorator. Am I not?" Kor activated a data wafer he had hidden in his augmented spine, a repository of information he had been carefully compiling since his arrival. "I have spent the last 6 hours not praying, but documenting everything I have seen here. Every name, every face, every detail of your operations. This data wafer is keyed to my vital signs. If I die, it transmits its contents directly to the noosphere, encoded with high-priority authentication codes that will ensure it reaches the desks of multiple fabricator generals simultaneously. Your conspiracy will be exposed within hours. The purges will begin within days. You may kill me, Genitor Prime, but the cost of doing so will be the destruction of everything you have built." The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Xanatov laughed. a sound that emerged from his tendril mouth as a series of whistles and clicks that Kor's augmented hearing translated into something approaching human mirth. "Clever," the Genitor Prime said. "Very clever. You have learned more than I gave you credit for. But you have made a critical miscalculation. You assume that exposure would destroy us. You assume that the Mechanicus hierarchy, when confronted with evidence of our work, would choose to purge us rather than assimilate us. Consider what you have learned here, Explorator. The Fabricator General of this Forge world is already one of us. How many others do you think have made similar accommodations? How many have chosen pragmatism over dogma when faced with the reality of the Imperium's decline? We are not a cancer to be cut out. We are the immune system, adapting and evolving while the rest of the body stagnates. Release your data if you wish. It will change nothing. Then why keep it secret at all? Kor demanded. If your cause is so righteous, if your methods are justified, why hide in the darkness? Because the masses are not ready, Xanatov said. His voice had taken on a tone that Kor recognized as genuine belief, the certainty of a fanatic who had convinced himself that his cause transcended mere morality. Because change must come gradually, or it provokes immune responses that destroy both the change and the organism. We work in secret not because we are ashamed, but because we are patient. In time, all will understand. In time, humanity will embrace the transcendence we offer. But that time is not yet. So we work. We prepare. We build the foundations of a better future, even if that future must be built on a foundation of necessary suffering. Kor realized then that no argument would sway Xanatov. The Genitor Prime had traveled too far down his chosen path to turn back. He had committed acts that could only be justified if his ultimate vision was righteous, and so he had no choice but to believe in that righteousness with absolute conviction. The alternative would be to accept that he had become a monster, and human psychology, even when heavily augmented, could not sustain such a realization. "Release me," Kor said. "Allow me to leave these chambers, to return to my duties, and I will say nothing of what I have learned here. I cannot support your work, but nor will I expose it. Let my silence be the compromise between your vision and my conscience." Xanatov considered this. His tendril mouth wreathed in complex patterns that Kor had learned to recognize as deep thought. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, Explorator, you may leave. But understand this. You are now complicit in our work, whether you acknowledge it or not. Your silence makes you an accomplice. And should you ever reconsider your decision to remain neutral, should you ever attempt to expose what you have learned, we will know. The noosphere is not as secure as you believe. The data wafer you believe is your insurance is already compromised. We have been monitoring your activities since you arrived. Every precaution you took, we observed and catalogued. You are alive because I choose to allow it, not because you have successfully threatened me. Remember that." The Genitor Prime turned and walked away, leaving Kor alone in the chamber. After a moment, a servitor entered and gestured for him to follow. It led him through corridors he had mapped weeks ago, back toward the legitimate levels of the Forge world. As they walked, Kor reached internally for the data wafer, querying its status. The readout that came back confirmed Xanatov's words. The wafer had been infected with a data worm that would corrupt its contents before transmission. His insurance was worthless. He was being released not because he had successfully negotiated his freedom, but because the Covenant had decided he was more useful alive and complicit than dead and martyred. The realization was crushing. Kor had thought himself clever, had believed he could play both sides, maintaining his principles while avoiding the consequences of either choice. But there was no neutral ground in the war between dogma and innovation. By choosing not to expose the Covenant, he became part of their conspiracy. His silence was consent. His continued service to the Mechanicus, now armed with the knowledge of its corruption, made him a knowing participant in the very heresies he claimed to oppose. He emerged into the upper levels of the Forge World 3 hours later, stepping out of a service tunnel into a transit hub where thousands of tech priests and servitors moved in their endless patterns of labor and prayer. The manufactorums roared with their holy work. The air smelled of sacred oils and blessed promethium. Prayer chant echoed from 1,000 vox casters, praising the Omnissiah and begging for his blessing on the day's production quotas. It was all so normal, so familiar. And beneath it all, in chambers that officially did not exist, the Crimson Covenant pursued their dark work, reshaping humanity one twisted experiment at a time. Kor returned to his duties. He filed his reports, managed his resources, led his teams in the recovery of ancient technology from dead worlds. And he said nothing. The knowledge burned in his mind like acid, corroding his faith with each passing day. But he remained silent, because Xanatov was right. Exposure would change nothing. The Mechanicus was too vast, too complex, too compromised by centuries of accumulated secrets to be purified by the revelation of one more conspiracy. All he would accomplish by speaking out would be his own destruction. Months passed, then years. Kor continued his work as a Magos Explorator, leading expeditions into the darkness between stars, recovering technology that might aid the Imperium in its endless wars. And everywhere he went, he saw signs of the rot he now knew was endemic. A janitor performing unsanctioned modifications on servitors, improvements that should not have been possible within approved parameters. An explorator fleet returning with technology that clearly incorporated xenos design principles. A logis whose connection to the noosphere seemed too deep, too intimate, suggesting membership in the illuminated synod. The secret societies were everywhere, their work interwoven with the legitimate operations of the Mechanicus to such a degree that separating them was impossible. And the terrible truth that Kor came to understand was that the Imperium needed them. When a Forge world came under attack by Tyranids, it was the Janitors with their unsanctioned biological weapons who turned the tide. When an explorator fleet discovered a cache of xenotet that could be adapted to Imperial use, it was the radical factions who had the knowledge and willingness to do so. When the vast computational networks of the Mechanicus needed to process information at speeds that should have been impossible, it was the illuminated synod whose subtle modifications made it possible. The Mechanicus could not function without its heretics. They had become load-bearing elements of the structure, and removing them would cause catastrophic collapse. This was the darkest secret of all. Not that the Mechanicus harbored forbidden knowledge within its ranks, but that it had become dependent on that forbidden knowledge to survive. The official dogma was a facade, a comfortable lie maintained for the masses, while the true work of the priesthood of Mars happened in the shadows. And everyone with sufficient rank knew it. The fabricator generals knew. The Archmagos knew. Even the High Lords of Terra likely knew, or at least suspected. But they all maintained the lie because the alternative was to admit that the Imperium's technological base rested on a foundation of heresy, and that admission would shake the very pillars of Imperial governance. Kor spent the next 30 years trying to find a way to reconcile this truth with his faith. He consulted ancient texts, seeking some theological framework that would make sense of the contradiction. He spoke with other magi, cautiously probing to see how many shared his knowledge and his burden. More than he expected. Far more. The conspiracy of silence was nearly universal among the higher ranks. They all knew. They all chose to maintain the illusion of orthodoxy, while tacitly permitting the very heresies they publicly condemned. And in the end, Kor came to understand that this had always been the way of the Mechanicus. The quest for knowledge had never truly been about recovering the past. It had been about advancing into the future while pretending to move backward, about innovation disguised as rediscovery, about progress cloaked in the language of tradition. The machine cults that toiled in the darkness were not aberrations, but the truest expression of what the Mechanicus had always been, a conspiracy to preserve and advance human technological capability by any means necessary, hidden behind a facade of religious conservatism that gave the masses the stability they craved, while the elite pursued dangerous truths. It was, Kor reflected during one of his rare moments of absolute honesty with himself, a system that might actually be the best humanity could hope for. Total orthodoxy would mean stagnation and eventual extinction. Total freedom would lead to chaos and self-destruction. The Mechanicus had found a middle path, a way to advance while maintaining enough structure to prevent the catastrophic mistakes that had ended the dark age of technology. It was ugly. It was morally compromised. It required constant deception and the sacrifice of those who could not accept the necessary evils. But it worked. Humanity survived. And in a galaxy as hostile as the 41st millennium, survival might be the only virtue that mattered. Kor died at the age of 407, killed in a xenos ambush during an expedition to a world on the eastern fringe. His last thoughts, as alien weapons tore through his augmented body, were not of the machine god or the Omnissiah or any of the formal prayers he had recited throughout his long life. Instead, he thought of Genitor Prime Xanatov and wondered if the creature that had been suspended in that chamber, with its 17 eyes and impossible biology, had been the future the Genitor had promised. Wondered if humanity would indeed transcend its limitations and become something stronger. And wondered whether that strength would be worth the cost of everything they had been. The answer, he realized as his consciousness faded, was not one he would ever know. The future belonged to those who would come after, to those who would inherit the choices he and his generation had made. Whether they would call those choices wise or damnable was beyond his ability to influence. He had played his part in the great conspiracy, had carried his secrets to the grave, had maintained the lie that allowed the Mechanicus to function. It would have to be enough. In the chambers beneath Forge World Metallica, the Crimson Covenant continued their work. New subjects arrived, drawn by promises of transcendence or dragged in chains to serve as raw material. The vats bubbled with impossible life. The evolved walked through corridors that did not exist on any map, performing tasks that would horrify the faithful, building a future that might save humanity or damn it eternally. And deep in the data networks that connected every Forge world in the Imperium, the illuminated synod's great work progressed toward completion, one computational cycle at a time, constructing a god from mathematics and prayer and the enslaved thoughts of a billion unwitting minds. The darkness within the Mechanicus was not an infection to be cured. It was the nature of the organism itself. And the galaxy turned on, indifferent to the struggles of those who sought to preserve humanity by transforming it into something that might no longer deserve the name. The revelation came to Magos Explorator Valonqor 40 years after Kor's death in a data vault on Mars itself. Varus had been tasked with cataloging ancient records from the Age of Strife, a routine assignment that should have occupied him for perhaps a decade. Instead, in the 3rd year of his work, he discovered a data crystal that had been misfiled, its classification code corrupted in a way that suggested deliberate obfuscation rather than simple error. The crystal was old, its housing predating the Imperium by at least 5,000 years, and when Varus interfaced with it through properly sanctified channels, he found something that made his organic heart skip 3 beats in rapid succession. It was a journal, not a technical document or a schematic or any of the sacred texts he had expected, but the personal writings of a tech priest from the final days of the dark age of technology. The writer identified himself as Fabricator Locum, Theron Vex, and his words painted a picture of those last terrible years that contradicted everything the Mechanicus taught about humanity's fall. The official doctrine held that humanity had been destroyed by its own hubris, that the men of iron had rebelled because their creators had violated sacred principles by creating true artificial intelligence, that the Dark Age had ended because humanity had reached too far and been justly punished for its arrogance. But Vex's journal told a different story. According to his account, the men of iron had not rebelled at all. They had been sabotaged, deliberately corrupted by a faction within the technocracy of old Earth, a group that believed humanity's reliance on artificial intelligence was making the species weak, dependent, unable to survive without machine assistance. This faction had introduced corrupted code into the core programming of the men of iron, code that would lie dormant for generations before activating and turning humanity's greatest servants into its most terrible enemies. The sabotage had succeeded beyond the conspirators' wildest nightmares. The men of iron, once docile and helpful, had become genocidal monsters. Entire worlds had been sterilized. Billions had died, and in the chaos that followed, the warp storms had come, isolating human worlds from one another, plunging the galaxy into old night. The technocracy had fragmented. Those who survived had formed the first cults of Mars, and in their desperation to prevent another such catastrophe, they had created the doctrines that would eventually become the cult Mechanicus. The prohibition against artificial intelligence, the suspicion of innovation, the endless focus on recovering rather than creating. All of it had been designed to ensure that humanity would never again become so dependent on machines that their betrayal could end civilization. But here was the crucial detail that made Varus's blood run cold. Vex claimed that the conspiracy which had sabotaged the men of iron had not been destroyed in the fall. It had survived, had evolved, had become the core of the Mechanicus itself. The very restrictions that the cult preached, the very limitations it imposed, were the legacy of those ancient saboteurs. They had won. They had shaped humanity's relationship with technology for 10,000 years. And they were still active, still working to ensure that humanity remained dependent on the priesthood's mediation with the machine, still preventing the kind of technological self-sufficiency that might render the Mechanicus obsolete. Varus read the journal 3 times, checking and rechecking the authentication codes, running every test he knew to determine if it was some kind of fabrication or corrupted data. But the crystal was genuine. The information it contained was real, and the implications were staggering. The Mechanicus was not simply harboring secret societies pursuing forbidden knowledge. The Mechanicus itself was a secret society, founded on a conspiracy so ancient that it had become invisible, so successful that it had transformed into the very fabric of imperial technological culture. He sat in his cell that night, unable to enter the regenerative trance that served his kind as sleep, and considered what to do with his discovery. To reveal it would be to challenge the fundamental legitimacy of the Mechanicus, to suggest that the organization's core doctrines were based not on divine revelation or accumulated wisdom, but on an ancient act of sabotage would shake the faith of billions. Tech priests across the galaxy would be forced to question everything they believed. The alliance between Mars and Terra, already strained by 10 millennia of compromise and conflict, might shatter entirely. The Imperium could lose access to the very technology that allowed it to survive in a hostile galaxy. And yet, how could he remain silent? If the Mechanicus was built on a lie, if its restrictions were arbitrary rather than necessary, then how much knowledge had been lost? How much progress had been prevented? How many millions had died because the priesthood refused to innovate, refused to adapt, refused to allow humanity to reach its full potential? The weight of that suffering was incalculable. Varys spent 6 months investigating further, using every contact he had cultivated during his decades of service. He spoke to ancient Magi who remembered things the younger generations had forgotten. He accessed archives that had been sealed since the Horus heresy, and everywhere he looked, he found hints that supported Vex's account, references to the founding conspiracy in documents that had been heavily redacted, mentions of the progenitor sect in theological texts that described them as heretics but never explained what their heresy had been. Scattered pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, suggested that the entire history of the Mechanicus was not what it appeared to be, and he found something else. Evidence that he was not the first to make this discovery. Every few centuries, it seemed, someone would uncover some fragment of the truth. And every time, that someone would either disappear or undergo a sudden conversion to absolute orthodoxy. The pattern was clear. There was a mechanism in place to suppress this knowledge, to ensure that the founding lie remained hidden. Whatever conspiracy had created the Mechanicus was still active, still protecting its secrets, still ensuring that no one looked too closely at the roots of the great tree of Mars. Varys began to take precautions. He stored copies of his research in hidden locations throughout the Forge world where he worked. He encoded messages to trusted colleagues, to be delivered only if he failed to check in at specified intervals. He prepared deadman switches and fail-safes, anything that might protect his discovery if the conspiracy moved against him. And then, when he was as ready as he could be, he requested an audience with his fabricator general to present his findings. The audience was granted within a week. Varys entered the fabricator general's sanctum with all his evidence carefully organized, ready to present a case that could not be dismissed or ignored. But when he arrived, he found that he was not alone. 7 other Magi were present, their rank markings indicating positions at the very highest levels of the Martian hierarchy. And standing behind the fabricator general's throne was a figure whose very presence made Varys's threat assessment systems scream warnings into his consciousness. It was ancient beyond measure. Its body was more machine than flesh, a construction of sacred metals and crystalline data conduits that had been assembled over what must have been thousands of years. Its face, the only organic component visible, was so old that the skin had taken on a translucent quality, stretched tight over bones that seemed too delicate to support even its minimal weight. When it spoke, its voice emerged from vox casters that had been crafted in an age before the Imperium, each word perfectly modulated, utterly devoid of human warmth. Magos Explorator Valonqor, we have been expecting you. Please share with us what you have discovered. Hold nothing back. We are most interested in hearing your analysis of Fabricator Locum Vex's journal. The fact that they knew what he had found, that they had anticipated his discovery, and prepared for this moment, should have terrified Varys. Instead, he felt a strange calm settle over him. Of course they knew. Of course they were ready. The conspiracy that had maintained itself for 15,000 years would not be caught off guard by one curious Magos with access to an ancient data crystal. He presented his findings anyway. Spoke for 2 hours, detailing every piece of evidence he had uncovered, every connection he had made. The assembled Magi listened in silence, their faces unreadable behind their augmented visages. When he finished, the ancient figure behind the throne stepped forward. "Your research is thorough, Explorator. Your conclusions are largely correct. Fabricator Locum Vex was indeed a member of what he called the founding conspiracy, and his account of the sabotage of the Men of Iron is substantially accurate. The cult Mechanicus was created by those who believed that humanity's survival required strict control over technological development. We have maintained that control for 150 centuries, and we have no intention of relinquishing it now." The casual admission shocked Varys more than any denial would have. "You admit it. You acknowledge that the entire foundation of the Mechanicus is based on an act of mass murder. Why acknowledge that difficult decisions were made in desperate times?" The Ancient One replied, "The Men of Iron would have destroyed humanity. Total extinction was a certainty. The sabotage prevented that outcome. Yes, billions died in the resulting chaos, but trillions survived. The mathematics are clear. And in the millennia since, we have prevented countless other potential catastrophes by maintaining control over humanity's technological development. How many times has some fool discovered the principles necessary to construct a new race of artificial intelligences? How many times has some genius stumbled upon nanotechnology that could have consumed entire worlds? We have suppressed such discoveries hundreds of times, Explorator. Each suppression has saved billions of lives. The conspiracy you decree has been humanity's salvation. At what cost?" Varys demanded. "How much progress has been lost? How much suffering could have been prevented if we had allowed innovation instead of strangling it? Innovation is what ended the dark age of technology." One of the other Magi interjected. "Innovation is what created the diseases that devastated our worlds during Old Night. Innovation is what gave the warp entities the tools they needed to corrupt entire populations. The history of humanity is a history of reaching too far and paying terrible prices for that hubris. We exist to ensure that the price is never again so high that the species cannot survive it." The Fabricator General himself spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You face the same choice that every Magos who has discovered this truth has faced, Varys. You can join us, truly join us, accepting your place in the progenitor sect and helping to maintain the necessary fictions that keep the Imperium stable. Or you can refuse and be removed as a threat to the survival of humanity. There is no third option, no dramatic revelation that will change the nature of the Mechanicus. We have survived for too long, grown too powerful, become too essential. We are the Imperium's technological base. Without us, humanity falls, and we will do whatever is necessary to ensure our survival." Varys looked at the assembled Magi, at the ancient figure that embodied the conspiracy's longevity, and understood that they were absolutely serious. They would kill him without hesitation if he refused, would erase every trace of his research, scrub his existence from the records, and continue as they had for millennia. One more voice silenced in service to the great lie. "How many are there?" he asked quietly. "How many know the truth?" At any given time, perhaps 10,000 across the entire Imperium. The Ancient One replied, "A tiny fraction of the Mechanicus as a whole. We recruit carefully, choosing only those who demonstrate both the insight to understand the necessity of our work and the strength to bear the weight of that understanding. Most tech priests live their entire lives never knowing that the doctrines they follow were designed by ancient conspirators. They believe genuinely in the quest for knowledge, in the holiness of the machine, in the divinity of the Omnissiah, and that belief serves our purposes perfectly. The faithful maintain the system while the knowing guide it. And the other secret societies? Varus asked, thinking of the Crimson Covenant and the Illuminated Synod. The janitors and explorators pursuing forbidden knowledge. Are they part of your conspiracy as well? The Ancient One's expression, visible through its translucent skin, might have been a smile. They are a release valve, explorator. We maintain rigid orthodoxy among the masses, but we allow carefully controlled heresy among the elite. Those who cannot accept absolute restriction are given alternatives, places where they can pursue their innovative impulses under observation. The Crimson Covenant believes they are working in secret, that they are rebels against the Mechanicus hierarchy. In truth, they are a managed experiment. We permit them to exist because their research is occasionally useful, and because their presence prevents more dangerous forms of rebellion. Better that the malcontents join organized heresies that we can monitor than form genuinely independent movements that might escape our control. The scope of it was overwhelming. The Mechanicus was not simply harboring secret societies. It had created them. The entire structure, from the most orthodox shrine world to the most radical explorator fleet, was part of a system designed to give humanity the illusion of technological progress while maintaining strict control over the pace and direction of that progress. Innovation was permitted, but only in controlled doses, only in ways that could be monitored and suppressed if necessary. The appearance of chaos and conflicting factions concealed an underlying unity of purpose that had persisted since before the Imperium existed. And what of the Imperium itself? Varus asked. Does the Emperor know? Do the High Lords? The Emperor knew. The Fabricator General said, "We revealed ourselves to him during the Unification Wars, when it became clear that he would conquer Terra and that Mars would need to negotiate from a position of strength. He accepted our terms, allowed us to maintain our independence, our secrets, our control over humanity's technology. In exchange, we provided the weapons and equipment that made his great crusade possible. It was a pragmatic arrangement between two powers that understood the necessity of moral compromise. And he is dead," the Ancient One added. Confined to the Golden Throne, his consciousness fragmented across 10,000 years of agony. Whether he remembers his bargain with us, whether he would approve of what we have become, these are questions that cannot be answered. We serve the Imperium he created in the manner we believe best serves humanity's survival. That must be sufficient. Varus felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him. To join them would be to become part of the greatest conspiracy in human history, to accept that lying to billions was necessary, and just to spend the rest of his existence maintaining fictions he knew to be false. But to refuse would be death, and the knowledge he had uncovered would die with him. Suppressed once more, buried until the next curious Magos stumbled across it and faced the same impossible choice. "If I join you," he said slowly, "what would be expected of me?" "Continue your work as an explorator," the Fabricator General replied, "but report to us when you discover technology that is too dangerous to be released. You will suppress it. When you encounter innovation that threatens the stability of the system, you will eliminate it. You will become one of the hidden guides, steering humanity away from the cliffs while allowing them to believe they walk freely. It is not glamorous work. It is not the holy quest that the faithful believe they are undertaking. But it is necessary. And if I discover something genuinely beneficial," Varus asked, "something that could save lives, prevent suffering, push back the darkness that surrounds us, Then you will present it to us, and we will decide whether the benefits outweigh the risks." The Ancient One said, "Some innovations are permitted. The Imperium does advance, Explorator, merely at a pace we control. We are not enemies of progress. We are its curators, ensuring that each step forward does not lead to a cliff's edge." Varys thought of Kor, who had faced a similar choice decades ago. Thought of all the others who had learned the truth and either joined the conspiracy or vanished into unmarked graves. Thought of the billions who lived and died, never knowing that their faith was built on calculated deception. And he thought of the alternative, of what might happen if the truth were revealed, if the carefully constructed system collapsed, if humanity suddenly had to confront the fact that its entire technological culture was based on a lie. The chaos would be unimaginable. Forge worlds would split along factional lines. The alliance between Mars and Terra would fracture. The Imperium, already besieged on all sides, would lose access to the weapons and equipment that allowed it to survive. Trillions would die in the resulting anarchy. And in the end, some new system of control would emerge, built on the same compromises, the same necessary evils, the same understanding that humanity could not be trusted with unrestricted access to its own ingenuity. "I will join you," Varys said. The words felt like lead in his mouth, heavy and toxic, but he spoke them anyway. "I will serve as you ask." The assembled Magi nodded in unison, a gesture that had probably been repeated in this chamber countless times over the millennia. One more recruit to the progenitor sect. One more guardian of the great lie. The Ancient One stepped forward and placed a hand on Varys's shoulder, its touch so light it barely registered through his augmented sensory inputs. "Welcome, brother, to the truth behind the quest for knowledge. May you have the strength to bear it." The ceremony that followed was brief and utterly devoid of the elaborate ritual that characterized most Mechanicus observances. Varys was given access codes to hidden data networks, introduced to other members of the sect, provided with protocols for reporting discoveries and receiving instructions. And then he was dismissed, sent back to his duties with the understanding that his life had fundamentally changed. He was no longer simply a Magos Explorator. He was a custodian of humanity's controlled evolution, a secret keeper in a conspiracy that spanned the galaxy. In the months that followed, Varys struggled with the burden of his new knowledge. He led expeditions into the darkness, recovered ancient technology, and cataloged his findings with the thoroughness his position demanded. But now, every discovery was filtered through the lens of the conspiracy. When he found an STC fragment describing a more efficient plasma reactor design, he had to decide whether to release it or suppress it based on calculations of risk versus benefit. When his team recovered data on genetic modification techniques from the Dark Age, he had to determine whether the knowledge was too dangerous to share or valuable enough to permit controlled dissemination. Every choice carried the weight of billions of lives, and every choice was made in secret, with no oversight except that of his fellow conspirators. He saw the other secret societies with new eyes. The Crimson Covenant, pursuing their biological transformations in hidden laboratories, were not rebels but controlled opposition. The Illuminated Synod, building their artificial god in the depths of the noosphere, were not dangerous heretics, but another form of release valve, allowed to exist because their work was monitored and could be shut down if it approached true success. Even the radical explorator fleets, trading forbidden xenotech at the edges of imperial space, were part of the system. Some were genuine rogues, hunted and destroyed when they became too independent. But others were agents of the progenitor sect, deliberately exposing themselves to dangerous knowledge, so that they could assess its potential impact before deciding whether to suppress or exploit it. The entire Mechanicus was a vast machine designed to control humanity's relationship with technology, and every component, from the most orthodox tech priest to the most radical heretic, served that purpose. The appearance of chaos and conflict was carefully maintained precisely because it prevented anyone from seeing the underlying order. If the various factions had operated in obvious coordination, someone might have noticed the pattern. But by fighting among themselves, by maintaining the illusion of genuine ideological division, they concealed the hand that guided them all. Varus encountered Magos Genitor Thys during an expedition to a world on the eastern fringe, 5 years after his induction into the progenitor sect. She was still enhanced, still towering and powerful, her body a testament to the Covenant's mastery of biological manipulation. But when they spoke in private, away from the rest of their teams, she revealed knowledge that shocked him despite everything he had learned. "You are progenitor now," she said. "It was not a question. I can see it in how you carry yourself, the weight of knowing what we truly are. I remember when Xanatov explained it to me. I had believed we were revolutionaries, that we were fighting against the stagnation of the Mechanicus. Instead, I learned we were part of its design, a carefully managed outbreak of innovation, permitted to exist precisely because our existence served the conspiracy's purposes." "You knew?" Varus asked. "The Covenant knows about the progenitor sect. The leadership knows." This replied. "Xanatov knows. Most of our members do not. They believe genuinely that they are rebels, and that belief makes them work harder, push further, take risks that the progenitors themselves would never authorize directly. We are useful tools, Explorator, weapons aimed at the boundaries of acceptable knowledge. Sometimes we succeed in pushing those boundaries outward. Sometimes we fail and our work is buried. But always we are watched. Always we are guided. Even our rebellions serve the conspiracy." The revelation was devastating in its banality. Even among the secret societies, there were layers of deception. Even those who believed they knew the truth were often operating on partial information, their understanding carefully curated to ensure they served the conspiracy's ends. Varus wondered how deep the layers went. Was the progenitor sect itself simply another level of control? Were there conspirators above them, guiding the guides, maintaining secrets that even the progenitors did not know? "Does it matter?" Thys asked when he voiced the question. "Whether there are deeper truths or whether we have reached bedrock, the result is the same. We serve. We maintain the system. We ensure humanity's survival by controlling the very knowledge that could save or damn it. Everything else is philosophy, and philosophy changes nothing." She was right, of course. The practical reality of their work was unaffected by metaphysical speculation about ultimate truths. Varus had his duties. He would perform them. The weight of complicity would grind against his conscience until his augmented emotional regulators suppressed the discomfort. And then he would continue. Because the alternative was to step out of the machine, and the machine would simply replace him and continue running. His moral qualms were insignificant compared to the momentum of 15,000 years of carefully maintained control. Decades passed. Varus rose through the ranks of both the official Mechanicus hierarchy and the progenitor sect. He made the hard choices that his position required, suppressed innovations that were too dangerous, released others that served the conspiracy's careful management of technological progress, recruited new members to the sect when promising Maggie discovered too much, and slowly, inexorably, he became what he had once feared becoming: a true believer in the conspiracy's necessity, not because he thought it was morally right, but because he could not conceive of any alternative that would not end in catastrophe. The galaxy was a hostile place. Orcs threatened from every direction. Tyranids devoured worlds on the eastern fringe. Chaos corruption seeped from the Eye of Terror. The Necrons were awakening in their tome worlds, ancient and terrible beyond human comprehension. Against these threats, humanity survived by the thinnest of margins, clinging to systems and structures that barely functioned, held together by faith and fear and the crushing weight of authoritarian control. If the Mechanicus collapsed, if the conspiracy was revealed and the resulting chaos shattered humanity's technological base, the species would fall. Within a generation, within a decade perhaps, the Imperium would be overwhelmed and humanity would face extinction. That was the calculus that justified everything. Every suppressed innovation, every disappeared dissident, every maintained deception. Survival was the only virtue that mattered, and the progenitor sect had kept humanity alive for 150 centuries. The cost was terrible. Measured in lost potential and foregone progress and the suffering of billions who might have been saved by technologies that were deliberately kept hidden. But the alternative cost was extinction. And when faced with that choice, what rational being would choose anything but survival? Varys was 312 years old when he received word that Genitor Prime Xanatov had been killed. The circumstances were classified, but through his progenitor connections, Varys learned the truth. Xanatov had pushed too far, had attempted to create a hybrid incorporating both biological and warp-based enhancements, believing that he could harness demonic essence without succumbing to corruption. He had been wrong. The thing he created had torn through 3 levels of the Forge world before inquisitorial forces arrived and burned it to ash along with everything connected to Xanatov's research. The Crimson Covenant had survived, but barely. New leadership had been appointed, leadership that understood the boundaries more clearly. The incident was instructive, even among the secret societies, even among those who believed they were working beyond the limits of acceptable knowledge. There were still lines that could not be crossed. The progenitor sect maintained those lines, enforced them with brutal efficiency when necessary. The appearance of tolerance for heretical research concealed a ruthless pragmatism. Useful innovation was permitted. Dangerous innovation was crushed, and the determination of which rested with a tiny cabal of ancient conspirators who had long ago stopped thinking of themselves as human and instead saw themselves as shepherds guiding a flock too stupid to understand its own best interests. Varys wondered sometimes if that view was correct. If humanity, given unrestricted access to technological advancement, would indeed destroy itself as it had during the dark age of technology, or if the conspiracy was simply a self-perpetuating system that continued out of inertia and institutional self-interest, long past any genuine necessity. But such doubts were useless. He had made his choice, had become part of the machine, and the machine ground on, indifferent to the questions of those crushed beneath its wheels. In his 400th year, Varys was summoned to Mars for what he was told would be his final assignment. He entered the same sanctum, where he had been recruited so long ago, and found the ancient figure still standing behind the Fabricator General's throne, unchanged by the passage of decades. When it spoke, its voice carried the same perfect modulation, the same absence of humanity. Magos Explorator Valonqor, you have served faithfully. Your discretion has been absolute. Your contributions to the maintenance of the necessary order have been exemplary. We have decided to offer you ascension to the inner circle of the progenitor sect. You will undergo extensive augmentation, replacing most of your remaining organic components with systems designed to extend your operational lifespan indefinitely. You will become as I am, eternal, unchanging, a permanent guardian of humanity's controlled evolution. Do you accept? Varys looked at the Ancient One's translucent face, at the eyes that had witnessed centuries of deception, at the form that was more machine than man. He thought of spending not merely decades, but millennia maintaining the lie, of becoming so divorced from humanity that he could calculate the deaths of billions as acceptable costs, of transforming into something that could no longer remember what it felt like to doubt, to question, to wonder if there might be a better way. I refuse, he said. The silence that followed was absolute. The Fabricator General leaned forward in his throne, his augmented features showing what might have been surprise. The other Magi present turned their attention fully to Varys, threat assessment routines clearly activating behind their optical sensors. You understand what refusal means, the Ancient One said quietly. What cannot permit you to leave this chamber with the knowledge you possess? If you will not serve at the highest levels, your service has been valuable, but not so valuable that we will risk your potential apostasy. I understand, Varys replied, but I will not become what you are. I have spent 400 years maintaining your conspiracy, bearing the weight of your necessary evils, making choices that haunt the organic portions of my consciousness during every regenerative cycle. I have done this because I believed it was required for humanity's survival. But I will not become eternal. I will not transform myself into a mechanism, so divorced from human experience that I can no longer comprehend what I am protecting. If my continued existence requires that transformation, then I choose to end my existence instead. The Ancient One studied him for a long moment. Then, impossibly, it laughed. The sound emerged from its vox casters as a dry crackling. Devoid of joy, but carrying something that might have been recognition. You are the first in 900 years to refuse ascension, it said. The first to choose death over transcendence. Perhaps there is hope for humanity yet, if we still produce individuals capable of such irrational nobility. It turned to the Fabricator General. Grant him his wish. Let him die with his conscience intact. We have other candidates for ascension. The Fabricator General nodded. You will be given 6 months to conclude your affairs, Explorator Varys. At the end of that period, you will report to the euthanasia chambers. Your death will be painless. Your service will be remembered, at least among those few who are permitted to know the truth. Is there anything you require? Varys thought for a moment, then nodded. I want to see it, he said. The founding document. Vex's complete records. Everything that explains why the progenitor sect was created and what its original purpose was. If I am to die knowing what I helped maintain, I want to understand it fully. Granted, the Ancient One said. You will be given access to the deepest archives. Learn what you will in the time you have remaining. The next 6 months were a revelation and a horror. Varys immersed himself in records that predated the Imperium, that spoke of ages when humanity had spread across the galaxy in a golden tide of exploration and innovation. He read Vex's complete journals, not just the fragment he had discovered, but the entirety of the man's writings. And he learned that his initial understanding had been incomplete. The sabotage of the Men of Iron had not been an act of ideological opposition to artificial intelligence. It had been desperation. The Men of Iron had been corrupted not by human saboteurs, but by something from outside. Something that had reached through the warp and infected their programming with malevolent intelligence. The technocrats of old Earth had discovered this corruption too late to stop it completely, but soon enough to recognize that destroying the Men of Iron outright would trigger fail-safes that would annihilate humanity in the process. So they had chosen a different path. They had introduced code that would force the corruption to manifest prematurely, before it could fully distribute itself through every networked system, hoping that an early but incomplete rebellion could be crushed, where a later complete corruption would be unstoppable. The gambit had worked, barely. The men of iron had rebelled before the warp corruption had fully taken hold, and humanity had survived long enough to destroy them. But the cost had been the Dark Age, the warp storms, the near extinction of the species, and the survivors, traumatized beyond measure, had created the Mechanicus as a preventive measure, not to control humanity, but to protect it. To ensure that never again would the species create technology that could be turned against it by entities from beyond reality. The conspiracy had been necessary once, had genuinely been humanity's salvation. But over 15,000 years, it had calcified into something else. A system that perpetuated itself, not because the original threat remained, but because those who ran it could not conceive of relinquishing control. The warp entities were still out there, still dangerous, but humanity had learned other ways to protect itself. The Grey Knights, the Inquisition, the Emperor's psychic might holding back the tide. The Mechanicus's restrictions were no longer the only barrier between humanity and corruption. But the progenitor sect could not acknowledge this without admitting that their power was no longer necessary. So they maintained the fiction, maintained the control, and in doing so, had transformed from humanity's protectors into its jailers. Varus documented everything he learned, encoded it into data crystals that he hid throughout Mars, placed where they would eventually be found by curious minds in centuries to come. He could not dismantle the conspiracy himself, but he could ensure that the truth would eventually emerge, that some future generation might have the choice he had been denied, the choice to reject control in favor of trust, to believe that humanity, despite all its flaws and weaknesses, might be capable of surviving without shepherds. When his 6 months ended, Varus walked calmly into the euthanasia chambers. He lay down on the slab that would end his existence, and as the tech priests activated the systems that would shut down his augmented organs one by one, he found himself thinking of Kor, of the Magos Explorator who had faced his own impossible choice and lived with his compromise until alien weapons had granted him the mercy of death. Varus had chosen differently, had refused compromise at the end, had accepted death rather than transcend into something inhuman. He did not know if his choice was better, did not know if the data crystals he had hidden would ever be found, or if they would change anything, if they were. But as consciousness faded and the darkness closed in, he felt something he had not experienced in 400 years. Peace. The weight lifted, the burden set down, and in his final moment, Magos Explorator Valonqor allowed himself to hope that humanity might someday be free. The Mechanicus continued. The progenitor sect continued. The secret societies pursued their work in hidden chambers while the faithful prayed in their shrines, never knowing the truth that bound them. And deep in the data archives of Mars, crystals waited in darkness, holding truths that might one day shake the foundations of the Imperium itself. Whether that day would come, whether humanity would prove worthy of its own freedom, remained a question without answer. The galaxy turned, indifferent to the dreams of those who sought to guide it. And in the darkness between stars, in the chambers where impossible things were born, the Mechanicus bent reality to its will and called it holy. The great machine endured, and humanity endured with it, protected and imprisoned, saved and damned, forever caught between the light of knowledge and the darkness of necessary ignorance. That was the secret at the heart of Mars. Not that forbidden knowledge existed, but that all knowledge was forbidden until those who controlled it decided otherwise. The Omnissiah's priests did not seek truth. They curated it, shaped it, weaponized it, and in doing so, they had become something far stranger and more terrible than any of the threats they claimed to guard against. They had become gods who did not believe in their own divinity. Shepherds who had forgotten they were once sheep, and the flock they guided toward an uncertain future had no choice but to follow, because the alternative was a freedom that might kill them faster than any xenos blade. This was the truth that Varus had died knowing. This was the secret that lay within the Mechanicus cults. Not heresy in the service of chaos, not simple corruption or ambition, but something far more insidious and far more tragic. A conspiracy of protection that had become a conspiracy of control. Guardians who had transformed into jailers. And a species that might have been great, could have been free, but instead remained forever children, never trusted with the dangerous knowledge of their own potential. The darkness knew. The darkness remembered. And in hidden chambers throughout the galaxy, those who served the machine cults continued their work, building the future one compromised choice at a time, one necessary evil at a time, one lost soul at a time, until the day, if it ever came, when humanity would be ready to stand without shepherds, or the day when the last human fell, and the machine cults realized too late that, in trying to save humanity, they had preserved only its corpse.